Well, hey, welcome to the Branch Podcast. Today, I am joined as always by pastors Chris and Anthony, and we're talking about a controversial topic of immigration. And here's our hope is that we can come at it from a biblical perspective so that we will have compassion and understanding from multiple sides of this argument. And I'm really confident it's going to be encouraging and informing to you. And always, if it is, feel free to share with family and friends. All right, so let's talk about creatine. Just kidding. We got so much response from that from last time. People just coming up to us asking about it, but we can talk about that later. But here's actually the question I want to start with is for both of you, a little bit more serious because today we have a little bit more serious topic. But have you ever found yourself torn between what feels compassionate and what feels just? And what did that feel like and how did you process that?
Yeah, I think for me, like raising my kids.
For sure, right?
That's the first thing I was going to say, parenting.
Yeah, parenting is the place where it like hits me most. When my youngest daughter, Abigail, was little, like, and when I mean little, I mean like 7, 8 years old, like she just had moments where she would lose her mind, like, and just like slamming doors, like could not get herself under control, so angry, screaming, like, and this, I'm not trying to embarrass her. I'm using it to illustrate the story, but like, in that moment, what I realized as a parent, there's part of me that's like so justice driven, like, oh, no, you didn't. Like, you're going to do what I said. You're going to knock it off. And then at the other point is like, I know she's exhausted. And I know when she gets to that place, like, she can't control it. Like, she just has gotten herself over the edge. And so inside of me is both this moment of like extreme compassion for her, knowing that like when you hit that place of, I don't have that great of emotional control as a 40-year-old. I'm 45 now, but when she was that little, as a 38, 40-year-old, how could she have as a 7 or 8-year-old? You know what I mean? Sure. And so like a lot of compassion, but at the same time, she's acting like a fool and I want it to stop. And so I think that's what sticks out in my mind. Like, and it's just hard because you do want to be compassionate, but you also want to not knock the behavior off.
Yeah. I mean, mine would be the same, but I'll use another example that, and I think you guys have probably been there many times too, but like particularly in pastoral ministry, you're dealing with people at times who've got a lot of problems, right? And one of the things that you see is people have a lot of problems that are self-inflicted, based on decisions that they've made. And so I'm just bent in a way where I am very black and white, and there's a part of me that can be pretty brash about that. And yet God in His grace, even though that's my natural bent over the years, I've had to learn that people do make decisions. And a lot of times, you know, the old saying, you know, they make their bed and they have to lie in it. One of the things that I've realized is a lot of times, you know, people make these decisions, but what you don't see is all the stuff behind it, right? Like that's the tip of the iceberg. And not everybody has the same story. And people have had some horrible experiences that have shaped them and shaped even the decisions that they made or proclivities in their lives and certain patterns. And so, you know, there's some even situations right now currently in the church, people that, you know, you look at their lives and you're like, man, you continue to make really, really foolish decisions. And then they come to you and they want help or they ask for prayer. And it's like, asking for prayer is not going to do a lot of good when you keep making foolish decisions, right? And so there's that tension in pastoral ministry for me, just to navigate that, to have a compassion and empathy for people, to realize human beings are complex and decisions are not made in a vacuum. They are cultivated deeply by context and family dynamics and experiences and past choices and all of those different things. But there's also a part of me sometimes it's like, man, like, you made that decision and now you're reaping the consequences of that. And so I think that can at times be a very difficult thing to navigate. And one of the things that I try to do, knowing my bent can be very black and white and brash, that in pastoral ministry, I have to lead with grace and compassion, but also at the same time, be able to be firm and clear in my communication of truth to say, you know, if you continue to do these things or you're in this situation because of those decisions that you're making.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm going to echo you two. I mean, what we're both, all three of us are talking about is the dynamic of relationships. That every relationship to some degree is going to have that. Because I would say I could come at it from either one of those, or being a boss. There are times with employees that you have a dynamic where you want to give every single person grace in situations, but you also are creating policies and procedures that then you have to use with other employees. And there is that odd dynamic at times where you have to say like, yes, I'm going to do this, but no, I can't do that. And like, you just have to find that, and you live in that tension because there is an obvious right at times. At other times, it's not an obvious right or wrong. It's just, well, if I do this now in the future, people are going to want that same privilege that you just got, and you have to kind of navigate that. So it's like that same tension. All right. So the reason why I asked that question is today we got the nice, easy topic of immigration that I want to talk about.
Nice.
But here's the thing about it, and I think we're all three good for it, is I actually am genuinely excited to talk about it, knowing that we're navigating into a hot topic, but that's what this podcast is about, in the sense that we're trying to help people understand better how theology actually impacts regular life. We don't want to just give people knowledge. We want them to apply it to their life, and that's where this came from. So on the immigration side of things, we have in our culture a pretty intense moment in this cultural moment, where you have, on one hand, there is a president who has promised to protect the nation, ran on the policy that he was going to deport anyone that was in our country illegally, and was elected by the nation to do that. Then he begins to enact that policy, and to no one's surprise, it's an ugly thing to watch. It's very difficult. And so then on the other side, there's a very human element to it. Obviously, every single person's a human. On the other side of it, we have the Christian perspective. And so you have both sides basically now yelling, figuratively and literally yelling at the other side, saying you're wrong. And so we, even as pastors and as a church, are oftentimes, people are asking us to wade into the confusion of this time. Some are asking us to take more of a, like, let's do a policy. What's the church's policy on this? But I think more often than not, we're getting people just asking, how should I think about this? How should I feel about that? And that's honestly where this came from. My son Titus, who has just such a compassionate heart, loves people, loves theology, loves discussing it. He asked me in our conversation, I was explaining to him the complexity of it. And honestly, as I was doing it, I thought, if he's wondering this, and I know other people are, we need to just sit down and talk about it. So that's what I hope to do today. Now, I say this not because I need to, but this is not an official policy of our church. We're just saying, as three pastors, this is how we view this complex issue that's not as simple as saying it's right or wrong. There's a lot of dynamics to this that we have to address and unpack. Here's my hope, is not only will this be beneficial, but it will help people have a framework to view other complex issues that they have to face in the future. So here's what I want to do. I want to start off, honestly, beginning with talking about, first of all, just the complexity of desiring the perfect in an imperfect world. Then I have like a list of questions that I'm going to go through, probably a little bit more systematic this week than we normally do. But I want to talk about that because I think sometimes people want the ideal, and we're just never going to experience the ideal this side of eternity. Let's talk about that. Why is that just simply a reality? What does the non-ideal look like? Do you get what I'm asking?
Yeah. I really think, when I think about the nature of that, like, I think we want, when we see the cross happen and we see Christ promise salvation, like, I think in our minds, we in the church go, like, that should be happening in the present. That those are things that should be happening now. So Christ comes to reconcile and make all things right. But the reality is, I guess I'm just repeating what you were just saying, but like, the reality is, like, we live in a time in between. And so we are going to always have this tension inside of us that we have to, we see the ideal, but long for the, but yeah, I'm just repeating exactly what you're saying. I'm just realizing that.
Keep expanding though. Keep expanding, because you're going a little bit deeper than I had even done. I mean, what you're talking about is that we're longing for something, but we live in the tension. It's not quite there, but we expect it, we desire it. And yet it's just like, it's not there. And so, like, there's oftentimes frustration with that.
Well, and I think that's it. And I think it leaves us in a place where we mourn and strive. We mourn the broken, and we strive for the ideal. And so, like, I don't think there's much more that we can do other than depend on God. And God puts this, he entrusts his plan of salvation. He entrusts the care of this earth, the care of other people. He entrusts it to broken human beings. Governments are broken human institutions. So it's going to be broken. It's not going to go perfectly. The church is a God-led, God-ordained institution and people, but it's full of people that are broken. You know what I mean? And so we're not always going to handle things the right way. And so I think we just have to come with that expectation that our role right now is to strive for the ideal and to mourn the broken. And so that leaves us to a place where we can acknowledge and call people to repentance. You know what I mean? Because because we don't match up to the ideal.
Yeah.
So we need to repent and chase that again. But also it calls us out of lethargy to where we just don't let everything go as it is. Like we call evil evil, and we speak against things that are not godly or not the ideal.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, you alluded to it, it's the already but not yet, right?
Yeah.
It's that Christ has come, that he died and he rose again, but we have not seen the fullest effects of that. And so we're living in the tension of even like salvation being a past tense. This was an event. This is something that happened. It's currently happening and it will happen. And so we have to live in the tension of that reality, just like in our own personal journey of faith. We can say, well, I'm not the person I used to be, but I'm also not the person that I will be, hopefully one day, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or when Christ returns, or when I die. So there is that element of just acknowledging even the biblical reality of when Christ returns and does make all things new. That is the only time where 100% of things will be made right. We're not currently living in that reality. And I even think, though, too, I think the dangerous side of that, and you alluded to it, is that can lead to maybe a place of apathy, right? Where we just say, well, things are always going to be broken. Things are always going to be messed up. And I would say, I mean, Jesus, even in the Lord's Prayer, right? What does he teach us to pray? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so there's a sense in which we're praying for that. We're trying to live out of that posture to see heaven come to earth. But also, I think of Paul in Romans 8, where he's like, man, the whole world has been groaning from the beginning. Right. Like we are living in the tension of that, and it's looking forward to that day where the glory of God is going to be revealed. In the past affliction and all that we've experienced is not even going to be worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed to us. Yeah. And so both of those things are true. And I think we just have to come to terms for that. Is like, we're praying for God to break into this world and bring healing and restoration and transformation, but also realizing that is never going to come in its fullest expression until Christ returns one day.
Yeah. And so one of the fallouts of the sin and the brokenness of our world is borders.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, borders, I would say restrictive borders. So Chris, I'm going to throw a question on you. You might not be able to answer. Spontaneous, okay? I did not prep you for this.
That's all right.
You're just the person that knows the book of Revelation the best, okay? So, and again, this is one part for fun, but also one part, maybe there's something good that can come out of this. Today I finished up, I'm just in my reading plan, the last couple chapters of Revelation. One of the things that stood out to me is it talks about basically in the end, when all things are restored, it says the kings of the world will bring basically treasures to God, glory to God. And as I was reading it, I thought, will there still be kingdoms in eternity? Will there be borders? And if so, is that a bad thing? So like that was my initial question is, are borders simply a byproduct of sin? Are borders just a necessity of life? Is the only bad thing of borders the restrictive element? What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think about like, and I've wrestled through this a lot with the whole idea of government. Government really are the enforcers of borders. It's the reign and rule of what we would call a traditional like nation state. Now, the world has not always operated as nation states. Sometimes it's been tribal. Sometimes it's been, but there always groups have kind of defined themselves and figured out ways to protect themselves, to govern themselves, to organize and socialize and all that. But I think what we see is not necessarily a removal of distinction between us as people. I mean, you see it in the book of Revelation. We're going to have ethnicity. We're going to have dialect. You know what I mean? Like there's going to be difference in us. We're not going to become homogenous. But at the same time, those walls break down for the purpose of uniting under King Jesus. And so while governments may continue to operate in the new kingdom, because why? Because if we're people, we might still need to organize. We might still need leadership. We might still need like protection, not protection because of the ways in which governments used to have to protect people, but we might still need all of the things to organize as human beings. But we do that now under the banner of Jesus Christ. And even the kings, like that's a picture of homage. And what it means is that like God will be Lord over all of these things. And so whatever organization it is, it will live up to the ideal and it will reflect what was God honoring and glorifying. And honestly, what governments now are called to be. And so like, governments are not bad in and of themselves necessarily. Or it's just a measure of organizing and protecting and leading a people. The problem is that governments are led by broken human beings that sometimes inflict pain instead of protect. And sometimes they look out for their own good instead of the good of their people. And you know what I mean? And so like you get into all of the like where brokenness starts to infiltrate this. And that's where the picture kind of like, we start to lose the, like, how could that ever be a positive thing?
All right. So it's only fair. Surprise him with a question. I'm going to surprise you with a theological question. Okay. So in the Old Testament, even as the Israelites went into the Promised Land, they distributed themselves based on their tribes.
Right.
So in that sense, they had their property, their borders, and yet the context of that was they were to be in relationship together. I mean, even at times, like actually also in my Bible reading today, I was looking at the story of when Jeroboam and Rehoboam in the kingdom split, and Rehoboam was about to wage war on them. He was raising up an army, and the prophet came to him and said, God said, don't do that. Don't fight your own people. And so he didn't. So you had in this context of the Israelites that they had borders within their nation, and yet they're supposed to be in unity. But then there were strict commands about how they related to the nations around them. And yet there were commands to be loving to sojourners who came into the land. So in one element, there's a restrictive element outside, another element welcoming. Can you talk about that tension? Because we're going to then start diving into like how we should view these things in the nations as we live now. But can you deal with that? I know, again, I'm just springing it on you, but.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. I mean, number one, like even going back to Genesis 11, one of the indictments against the people of the world is their own self-reliance and even self-righteousness, right? So Genesis 11, Tower of Babel, God disperses people across the face of the earth. So on one hand, I would echo what you said, like the idea of a diversity of people brings glory to God, like the uniqueness. When you look across the world today and see all these nations, as Revelation would say, nations, tongues, tribes, right? The peoples of the world in their diversity represent the beauty and the goodness and the glory of God. On another hand, like in Genesis 11, there's a sense in which God's judgment against sin is enmity between these people groups, right? Like they're not able to actually communicate, like he changes their languages, disperses them over the face of the earth so that they're not all able to work together. But I would say, again, this is in judgment against sin. Just like in Genesis 3, we see the curse come across the earth for sin. So this is not the ideal, right? This is not ultimately God's full redemptive, restorative plan. But I would say in the case of Israel, one of the big issues that you see, it's also why the Israelites were called not to intermarry with women of other nations, right? Because they were concerned, God was concerned about paganism and worship of false gods, false idols. And repeatedly throughout the Old Testament, I mean, he warns them, like even I was just reading in Deuteronomy 17, I think it is, where he basically says like kings they're not to take wives of other nations because it will be their demise. Like it will ultimately lead them away. So God's entire plan, I think, for Israel was they're meant to be a beacon for the glory of God in the world. They're meant to be a microcosm, if you will, similar to in the New Testament, the church, to point the peoples of the world, pagan nations who do not know God, to the one true God. And so on one sense, there's a distinction. And if those distinctions completely collapse, they lose their identity as the people of God, and also not only lose their identity, but they lose their purpose, right? In God's grand narrative, we know now that from Israel, the Messiah was going to come. I mean, this is back to Genesis 12, God's promise to Abram, he would make out of him a great nation. And through that would be a blessing to the entire world. So this is God's plan. So there is a distinctiveness to the nation of Israel. And yet, as you mentioned, the way that they treated people, sojourners and foreigners, was also meant to represent something about the heart of God and his compassion for people. And even you see examples of people who were proselytes, right? People who became a part of the people of God, who were not by heritage. They weren't Jewish. They weren't Israelites. And yet they are invited into this. And so you see glimpses of God's grand design of the future, that Revelation picture that one day all of these people are going to be under the kingship of God, right? All of these people together are going to worship together. But in the Old Testament, there was an importance in the distinction, I think, for the, if you want to say, the missiological purpose of the people of God, that they had to be distinct because they were holy and set apart for the purposes of God, which had much greater bearing than just the nation in and of itself, right? It was a further redemptive plan that we now see currently unfolding in the world.
But I was just going to say, I love what you were just saying, because I think it still plays out for us as Christians, because there is a distinction to being a Christ follower.
Yeah.
And yet it's always inviting. It's always open to come in. But when you do, it's defined by a certain set of beliefs. It's defined by certain ways of living, as laid out by Christ. You know what I mean? And so like, there's always this kind of tension between the distinction and the invitation, the openness. Yeah. And so like, I feel like I think that's going to play, like, it feels like that's kind of the economy of God, is like, everybody's welcome. You play by these rules. You know what I mean? And so like,
you don't make up the rules. And, and that was true even in the Old Testament, right? Like, God not only gave his people specific instructions for how they were supposed to treat the sojourner, the foreigner, the refugee, but also how those people, when they came in, were to conduct themselves and what they could and could not do. And I think even in the midst of this conversation around immigration, sometimes people will highlight the one side and forget the other. And I think both of those are important in the midst of what we're actually talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So the world falls in sin, and as a result, we're seeing things like nations and divide, and God allows for governments to be raised up. And you see that God is actively involved in the rising and falling of governments. Multiple times in the Old Testament, God literally just says, I raised them up for this purpose. So basically Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Egypt, like all these different nations, God raises them up. We have in the New Testament, Romans 13, that all authority has been established by God. And it just words in such a way to remove any loophole to that. There is no authority that has been established, by God. So God allows there to be governments. What is permissible then for those governments? Because what's their role? I'll say it that way. From the perspective of God, why is he allowing them to be raised up? Because you even referenced that it's possible we might still have governments and organization in heaven, but like right now, what's the purpose of government? Because when we look at this immigration issue, again, we have elected an official who ran on the promise of doing this. And so he's living it out, and it's legal according to our laws. And I realize there's some people battling some elements of that, but he's able to enforce the laws. But again, you get what I'm asking.
Yeah, I think where my mind goes with that question is yes, governments are raised up by God, but governments are also mandated to care for their people. Like it's for the flourishing of society. The things that God gives us are for the flourishing of everyone. And if they're not, like if it's not doing that, I think it's not living up to the thing that God designed it to be. So like, I think governments are given the authority and the responsibility of caring for their people, and the way in which they do that matters. And so like, I think you can accomplish something and totally miss the heart of why you've been called to do that. I mean, I look the same voice that says respect your, like Romans 13:1 is the same voice who called Jesus Lord, which was a anti-government saying.
Yeah, it was a political statement.
It was a political statement. You know what I mean? And so like, there is that tension where like the Christian plays a role within these government entities to both support, but also, and to acknowledge God's reign and rule over the governments, but also to keep them doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so like to point towards the ideal that what we were talking about earlier. And so like, I think governments are given to us by God as a way to organize and to bring flourishing in human society. When it doesn't do that, I think it becomes problematic. And I think there's a place for speaking to that.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I was just say, government exists for two words that I think of: organization and order. And you kind of hit on that, right? Like when we look at the way God created the world, it is a world full of order. And so for the people who would say like, man, anarchy is the way to go. It's like the problem is God didn't create it to be that way. Things are meant to be conducted in order. Just like in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul says the same thing about church services, right? They're meant to be, God is a God of order. Things are meant to be done in an orderly fashion. and therefore point not only to God, but ultimately lead to what you said, human flourishing. Like the reason the government exists is to, I would say, not necessarily to be the main vessel for human flourishing, but rather to protect things that lead to human flourishing. So to remove the things that potentially hinder human beings from being able to flourish. And I would say where we really get into dangerous territory, where the government has now gone outside the boundaries of what God has designated, when human beings are no longer treated as image bearers of God, or they are no longer allowed to operate as image bearers of God, I think is where we get into troubling territory. And that then begins the conversation of what does it look like for Christian engagement in that? And even that conversation is so like it's so diverse, because right now we're talking about, we live in America, right? We live under a democracy where people have the right to vote. We can legislate different policies and we have a say. There are many Christians, millions of Christians around the world right now that live under governments and regimes where they have no say, like they have no power given to them to be able to decide those things. So I think even in the midst of that conversation, I think there is government in the sense of what God intended it to be. And then there's Christians living under all kinds of different governments that are a large spectrum of how they actually treat their people and what actually leads to human flourishing.
Well, yeah, even thinking about the premises of the United States, like, and how it's set upon these ideals, we call them the Bill of Rights, like these ideals that are for human flourishing,
right?
Like what we thought, or what the founding fathers thought was human flourishing, inalienable rights. You know what I mean? And so but the government's responsibility is to ensure that happens for all the people in their society. You know what I mean? And so not just some, but everybody.
Yeah.
And going back to the biblical thing that you were talking about, like some of the passages ensure that Israel make sure that the foreigner is treated the same way. They get the same opportunities. And so even to this dialogue, do they have the same rights as, even if they're an illegal alien, do they have are they given the same rights, the same processes as we say is valuable for all human beings under the law? You know what I mean? And so those are the question marks. Those are questions that I wrestle through. Are they treated with dignity, humanity? You know what I mean? Because I think that's the role that the government's meant to play. And I don't know. Maybe I'm raising questions you're not getting to yet, but.
Well, no, I mean, that is the discussion. And I think even the hesitation in your voice, it shows the complexity of this issue is that we're trying to navigate it, explaining it, while also recognizing there's some answers we're just not going to like.
Sure.
There's not a solution. Because I would say for both of you talked about the responsibility of the government to provide order. Well, then the next question is, and when there's disorder, how do they enforce it? Because you have governments are to arrest, to imprison, even to go to war, to defend. All of those, there's just no clean way to do that. And I think that's the struggle. Like when I was talking to my son Titus about it, I said, Titus, you need to understand, this issue is so complex because, and anyone that's listening, I'm not making political statements as I say this. These are political issues. I'm not making political statements. You had administrations that had one policy concerning immigration with totally open borders. Yeah. President Biden was pretty open about that. So you have in one administration, borders were open, which caused a lot of complexities. The next administration goes, I'm going to come in now and fix what this other group allowed, which was from their perspective illegal and unsafe for our nation. And so the only way to fix what was broken is there's no clean way to do that. And that's what I'm trying to explain to Titus is this is an issue that you can't say okay, we have this beautiful image of truth, and so therefore it being enforced is going to be a beautiful thing. Yeah. There's complexity. There's ugliness with sin and fixing brokenness. There's always just a difficult pathway to do that in anyone's life. I mean, the person who gets way out of shape, the process of getting back in shape is difficult. When there's complexity in relationships, if a marriage is really falling apart for years, the pathway to get healthy, it's complex before it's beautiful. And the same thing when we talk about when there's disorder in nations, the process to make order is oftentimes ugly. It's oftentimes there's collateral damage, there's complexities. And then on top of it, you are dealing with people who are not professing to be Christians, oftentimes on all sides of the argument. And so what happens is they're not respecting image bearers, and that's not even a value system to them. Right. And also, they're not even looking to the law of God. They're looking to the law of the U.S. What are our laws? And that trumps everything else. Okay, so that leads me then to my next question. For us as Christians, we live in that tension. We're Christian Americans, so we live under the authority, Romans 13, honor the authority. But when there's a conflict, we can appeal to a higher authority of God when there's a conflict with the law of God. How do we coexist in this world where we need to respect the government, we need to love the sojourner, we need to treat people as image bearers of Christ, the government wants to come in and enforce laws, and we need to submit?
Yeah.
What's the tension? How would you guys navigate those moments? And that's kind of why I posed the question to start this of like, when you face that moment of justice or compassion, how do you navigate that?
Well, I think the word complexity is important because I think we're talking about things on a spectrum here. So like even to talk about the issues right now of immigration or like the whole mass deportations and like what ICE is doing, there's such a spectrum of situations, right? Because there are people who are here illegally who are criminals, right? There are people who are here illegally who are just trying to have a good life. They're not causing any problems, and they're trying to make a better future for themselves and their families. There are people who are here because they have some sort of work status to be here. There are people who are here and their status is refugees. Like there's a spectrum even within that conversation. And then I think you get into, okay, as a government, each of those different groups like is going to be addressed differently, right? And they should. Like we all should be able to rally around and say a person who is here illegally and is committing crimes should absolutely be punished for their crimes. They should be dealt with very swiftly. Again, and we don't even have to say like inhumanely. As Christians, we even believe like even as criminals, like there's a sense in which they're still image bearers of God, and we should fight for the sense of people are being treated with humanity. And I think as a country, we do that very well in comparison to many other countries around the world. And so I think we also shouldn't lose sight of that for those who are up in arms about this stuff, is the way that we handle these things is a way more compassionate than many other countries around the world would handle these same topics. So I think you have to acknowledge that this is very complex. And when we are very black and white about stuff, I just don't think we do the conversation justice. We have to get into the acknowledgement that, man, there's a massive spectrum of things. And if you're just watching CNN or just Fox News, you're going to get a certain flavor of things that is going to be pushing an agenda. It's not going to just be pure facts. It's going to be facts that are shown to you with a certain bent. And I think that's one of the biggest problems right now. Like the media that people are following and listening to gets people riled up, and they want to make a blanket statement over, they see one thing, this is what's happening in every single case. Well, that's just not the truth. That's not the reality of it. So I think as Christians, I think the difficulty of, we should be able to say, God instituted government. Government has the ability and the right to enforce laws, particularly when laws, like even the idea of national security can be a good thing when it's fighting for the flourishment of its own people, right? We're talking about national security. We're not saying countries should go and wage war with everyone else to try to take over more land. I'm saying protecting our borders or protecting the inhabitants of our land, that's a good thing. Like in securing people's safety so that we, even as Americans, have our families and our marriages and our children can live and flourish as a society. That's not a bad thing. The problem is when we are now dealing with people who are immigrants and refugees and who are here illegally, how do we treat those people, right? To me, it's bigger than just, does the government have the right to deport people? On one hand, I would say, well, if the government has the right to enact laws, then to some degree, the answer is yes, they do. If someone is here illegally, they have the right to be able to deport them. The tension comes in as Christians is, how are those people being treated? Because just because that person is an American doesn't make them any less of an image bearer of God. And I would say that is one of the dangerous territories that we get in as Christians who are Americans, not as American Christians. When we put our allegiance first to America, where we're willing to say, well, they're not an American, therefore we can just write off any rights they have as human beings. That's when I think we get into sinful territory as Christians, because we should care for human beings. They're image bearers of God. They should be treated with dignity and respect. But I don't think that always has to be at odds with our country enforcing laws, even laws around the concept of deportation and whether or not people are here legally.
Yeah, I was going to say, for me, like how I think about it and how I think I would navigate it is exactly that. Like we have to have laws to govern how we're going to handle our borders. We just don't have the supplies, the ability, like the land, the space for completely open borders. And I don't think that's a secure thing. I think most people would say that. I think we need people to enforce our laws, but there are a whole lot of laws around how that happens.
Exactly.
And so like, I think that we have to be super careful. And I realize, like, I think people change those laws at times. What is justifiable? What was justifiable by a police officer in 1957 in Alabama, we would say is deplorable. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so like, we have to think critically about even the laws that and the leeway that law enforcement is given, I think, by the government. But at the same time, we do want them to enforce the law, and you're right, that's going to be messy.
It is messy
because how do you know who are the criminals? How do you know what I'm saying? Like, and so that's the question that it keeps pouring in my mind. Like, there's not going to be a clean way to do this. But I think also too, when you start to see things where it encroaches towards like people being stopped just because they share the same skin color as an illegal immigrant.
Sure.
People stopped because they have the same type of name. I mean, back in the early teens of America, you and I, man, my grandfather's name was Longo. You know what I mean? And your last name's Lombardi.
Yeah.
Like there was discrimination against that. You know what I'm saying? And so like, anybody's name that end with an I or an O
or a vowel.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So like, I think that we just have to be careful that we're paying attention to the ways in which things are happening, along with we should fully 100% support the laws that are right and good, and we should submit to the government. And at the same time, I feel like we live in a country that has given us the allowance to have the voice, and especially as Christians, to go, that doesn't seem right to me. That needs adjusted. You know what I mean? And so like, I think that when we think about this topic, we should look at it in a nuanced way. We should look at it with a way that goes like, are people being treated humanely? Do extreme ends extreme needs justify extreme ends? And I think what scares a lot of people in the United States is that when you start to see that take place, it starts to look and resemble, though vaguely, places that went that direction, and it became very problematic in the nations. You know what I mean? That's why you start to see people called fascists, and you start to, you know what I'm saying? Like, and so I think, I'm not saying that that's the case. That's not where we're at. I don't think that, but I think people see that and they go, oh, that's where we could be headed, because this looks like it's trending that way. But I think we have to be even careful in that, like, because I don't think that we're there. But I don't know. I think we have to wrestle with that tension, and we have to think critically. How do I support, and how do I want law and order? I want things to be made right, and I want a civil society, but
I think
is it handled the right way?
That was just going to say, I think it's the what and the how, right? So like the what is, okay, if the United States has these laws, right, like around immigration, around borders and securing borders and deportation, if we have laws, the question is how, in a humane way that honors the dignity of human beings, including illegal human beings who are here. To me, that's a really important part of the conversation as Christians, because I think that is where there should be at times, if we're finding out the way that people are being treated is they're not being treated as human beings, they're being treated like animals, they're being treated like, like all of them are criminals, right? Again, in the sense of some of them are not criminals. Some of them are here just trying to make a better life for themselves. And again, that's not to diminish that there are still laws that we have as a nation. But as Christians, we should care for people who, just because they're not Americans, the way that they're being treated with dignity should be a part of that. And so I think it's not just the what, it's the how. And that's where I think we do have a voice as Americans to get into, okay, how are we actually dealing with these situations?
Because I think the other part of it too is like, because this is, you said there are a lot of people, there are a lot of immigrants here that came through like under other administrations where the border was just pretty much open, that are trying to pursue legal means of getting their status as either legal immigrant or U.S. citizen, are getting caught up in the midst of this. And so like you have to, like, how do we mitigate for that? Because I think right now, and I don't know if I was listening to a podcast this morning, and there were some pastors from Minneapolis talking about this, because Minneapolis was kind of ground zero for this, and they were talking about that there's a 30% return rate on arrest to actually being criminals that need to be deported, and so like 30% of arrests are criminals that need to be deported. That means there's another portion of people being arrested and detained, and they're here doing the thing they're supposed to be doing. You know what I mean? And they're following the rules. So like we have to do extreme ends, I keep butchering it, but do extreme ends, justify extreme means. And I think we have to be careful of that.
Yeah. Okay. So when we look at it, even if you look at the Old Testament, the government was allowed to classify what was a sojourner versus what was an invader.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they were able to, because I mean, obviously, if someone's coming to bring harm, they were able to fight back and to go to war. Nowadays, for a Christian, what should the Christian's response be if, on one hand, there's people involved, but also there's a government? How do they respond if they don't agree to what the government's doing? Do Christians have a right to rebel? Do the Christians have a right to interfere? Do Christians have a right to protest? I mean, like, I think a lot of people are wondering what are they called to do? What should they be doing in this time?
Yeah, I think this gets into, and I know this was one of the questions, but like, I think it gets into the question of like, as Christians, how are we supposed to operate, in the sense that, like, for example, we are not the ones who are policing the laws, like, any more than if I have a guy who's riding me from behind on the highway and he's going 25 miles per hour over the speed limit. Like, I'm not following him and calling the police and be like, hey, there's a guy speeding. I'm not policing the laws of the land in that sense, right? But there is a sense in which how I treat that person, how I respond to that person. Did I flip that person off? Did I get in a road rage fight on the side of the road with this person because they did that? Yeah. Like, there are those distinctions of like whether or not that person was breaking the law versus how I conduct myself or react or respond to them. I think that's a maybe oversimplified example of this, but it's really the question of like, okay, as Christians or as the church, people who are in this country, even if they're in this country illegally, how do we treat them? Are we now like snitches for the government, where we're trying to get in contact with somebody with ICE to come because we find out that our neighbors are here illegally? Like, I don't think that that's our calling as Christians. I think our calling would be, what does it actually look like to love and serve our neighbor in the most literal sense in that way? And I think that's where there is the real tension for us, is to say, on one hand, I can say, the government does have the right to enact these laws and to enforce them. They do. On the other hand, as a Christian, I'm called to a higher standard that transcends national borders with what it means to love my neighbor, regardless if they're American or they're here illegally, what it looks like to love them, what it looks like to show Christ through word and deed to them. And so I think that's where there's different levels of what we're talking about here. Then we're getting into the whole other side of policy. And if there is inhumane treatment of refugees or immigrants here, what does it look like? Is it peaceful protests? I think that could be it. Is there opportunity for legislation to change where we have the ability to vote? Or is it simply just, hey, we see a group of people in our community that are being ravaged by this reality, and though I acknowledge the right of the government to do this, I don't think the way that they're doing it is right. It's hurting families. If someone from a family that maybe is working and providing for them gets deported, or even maybe they don't get deported, maybe they just get detained for weeks or months, and that family is left out in the cold, in the sense of like they have no one providing for them. What does it look like as a Christian to step up and to serve that family, to bring them groceries, to love them? And I think that's where the tension of this and the messiness of this gets is, yes, we're Americans. We might be American citizens, but we're called to a higher standard of love as Christians that, again, does transcend nationality, tribe, all of that stuff. Like, we're not to discriminate in our call to love people. And so I think all of those things can be true at the same time, that the government has the right to do this, and yet we can maybe disagree with how they do it, and acknowledging that if it's hurting people, this is where the church can step in to love people, even people who are not here legally.
I was going to say, I think of the book of Acts, and when I'm thinking about this question, because what we see Philip step up into a carriage with someone from Ethiopia.
Ethiopian eunuch.
Proclaim the gospel to him. And yet at the same time, we have Paul and Peter. They sit in a prison and they speak to the jailer, who is a either Roman or Jewish, like, you know what I mean, like captor.
You got Acts 10, Peter going to Cornelius' house. And,
yeah. And so you have these interactions with both government officials and soldiers, and with those outside of Israel, and with fellow Jews. And the posture towards all of them is, I want to serve you, I want to show you the gospel, and I want you to see that there's something greater than all of this. Now, like, and I think that's where we have to listen to the I feel like I say this every podcast. We have to listen to the Holy Spirit and see what the Spirit's doing, because I think you're right. I think there's more opportunity for us to love, to serve, and to share the gospel than there are for us to be the ones who either call ICE or interfere with them doing their job, because I think that's problematic as well. You know what I mean? And I think it steps across the line. I think in the Bill of Rights, if I'm not mistaken, we have the right to peacefully protest.
Sure.
That all that is raising our voice to say, like, I don't think that this is right.
Sure.
You know what I mean? But that's not necessarily being enacting rebellion. It's not laying hands on government officials. You know what I'm saying? It's not being a terrorist in harming government things to shut that down. You know what I mean? And so, like, I think we have ways in which we can say that's not right, but then we have to love and respect people on both sides, the ICE agent and the immigrant.
Yeah. Okay, so that somewhat leads me to my final question: is how should we relate to someone who views this topic differently than us? There will be people that hear this podcast. Potentially, it could be offended on both sides.
Sure.
I know that there are people who want the church to take a more active stance in being vocal about this, and others want the church to stay out. And so, like, you see it on social media. I mean, at least my feed. I don't know if your guys' feed's this way, where someone's coming in hot one way, someone comes in hot the other way. If you're on one side and you see someone else, what should your posture be? Is it to correct them? Is it to just secretly in your heart be angry at them?
Sure.
I mean, like, honestly, like, how can we use this moment knowing that we might view things differently? Does that mean that there needs to be a divide? If we feel like someone's doing something, and even in our own convictions, we go, man, that feels like it's a compromise, but yet they're holding to their values. Like, do we need to confront? I mean, how do we respond in this season?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we've talked about this many other times, right? Like, we as a culture have just lost the ability to really have civil dialogue. And a big part of that is number one, we are terrible at listening. Like, we're terrible at honestly just listening to other people. Like, when we find out a person views things differently than us, we immediately write them off. And so we can't hear anything that they say.
And when you're saying listening, you're meaning it more than just hearing the words to prepare your next argument.
Seeking to understand, like being charitable in your humanity, to say, like, I have two options. I can just assume that this person is the most morally bankrupt, monster of a person, or I can just assume maybe they're misinformed, or maybe they view things from a perspective that I could actually learn from, And I think most people just don't even leave room for that. Like, there's an arrogance of our culture that we're so opinionated that we don't even give room for someone else to maybe share their side of things, or even try to understand, try to listen, so that we can understand where they're coming from. And the truth is, maybe they are misinformed. Like, again, I alluded to it earlier today. If we're listening, if we're following one area from the media, like, things are going to be skewed. And we have to start by even just acknowledging that reality. Yeah. Like, we do not have access to all objective truth about these situations. Which is why, like, you're talking about that podcast, like, being able to listen from people that are like boots on the ground. They're there. Like, you can listen to Fox News and CNN and their spin on things and how their flavor of how these things are taking place. Or you can listen to someone who's like actually seeing it unfold, who has the same worldview as me. Like, they believe in Jesus, they believe in the church, and here's what they've experienced. Here's what they've seen. And I can take that information and I can process that and say, how does this inform what I already think? How does this critique what I already think? How does it change what I already think about this topic? And, like, we should, as a culture, always want to take in new information and be willing and humble enough to say, as we've always said, right? I could be wrong. I could be wrong. I could be misinformed on this. I think, on the other hand, there are some people that have really staunch views on one side or the other that I think, even from a Christian standpoint, are just biblically misinformed. Like, I just think, I would say their conclusion is maybe it's a focus on what I would call like political idolatry. Like, they're so focused on being on a political tribe that they're actually not all that concerned with the nuances of scripture and how complicated these conversations really are. And they're just going to be staunch in that. But I would say, even for those people, our treatment of them shouldn't change, right? I think that's the danger of this whole conversation, is we're so quick to villainize people who view things differently, especially people who do take a strong position in the other direction as us. That shouldn't change the way that we treat them. But at the same time, I think there's a varied spectrum. I think for some people it is misinformation. For other people, it's our maybe misunderstanding of them. Like, we just assume based on a Facebook post or they shared an article, we assume everything about what they believe and why they believe it, rather than actually trying to engage in a thoughtful dialogue where we're trying to learn from a perspective that we acknowledge is very different from our own.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that answer, because I think it was so good. The only thing I think is, like, we have a tendency as human beings to take issues that have real lives and real people attached, and we separate it from that and make it just about the issue. Yeah. And I think a lot of it is because we have the ability, we are sitting here and we have the ability to have this conversation without it being a fear of us walking out the door and having an ICE agent meet us at the door and arrest us. Same thing. We also have the ability to sit here and talk about this without having to be the one to figure out how to do your job, to be handed a mandate by your boss. So you're going to handle it this way, and to know how to navigate that tension. Like, you have a perspective as an ICE agent where you know you should love people. You're a Christian, you're following God, and yet you're told to do these things that violate that. Like, okay, so now these are not just entities. These are real people who are dealing with very complex things that are touching their lives. And so we have to be careful that we don't mix knowing with having the privilege of not having to live it. You know what I mean? And so like, I think we can have opinions. I think we should form thoughts about how we perceive and what we know. And it requires us to do exactly what you just said, of listening to other people, taking other people's perspective in, so that we can form informed opinions. That's good. Because otherwise, it's just too dangerous to make it about sound bites. It's too dangerous to make it about political parties or even ideologies, and without tying it to the people that it's really affecting. And I think we just have to be willing to go, oh, you know someone who has been affected by that? Man, I see why you think that way. Or you know somebody that has had a rock hit them in the face because they were just doing their job. Man, I hear why you feel the way that you feel. You know what I mean? So, like, I think we just have to see the humanity in this and remember that above everything else.
And just to add on to that, like, the idea as Christians to take the middle way, right? And what I mean by that is, like, we've talked about this before, but one of the things that pains me the most to see for Christians, like, falling into these tribes as if they can't be critical of their own leanings, right? If you lean one way or the other, as if it has to be an all or nothing. And that's so dangerous, because the reality is neither side, whether you're on the right, you're on the left, gets everything right. And the reality is the way of Jesus oftentimes causes disruption to both sides. And so, like, being able to, like, even what you just said was such a beautiful example. Like, if you're the person who's advocating for the immigrant, for the refugee, and you just have this staunch position, and then you meet someone who has a brother or has, you know, a son who's an ICE agent who's experienced those things, man, like, what a humanizing way to think about this topic. And so, like, what you're saying, like, coming at it from a place of compassion, from a place of empathy, realizing that all of our experiences aren't the same. And it is easy to talk about things that, in large in part for us, are kind of theoretical. They're not the lived reality. And so even just having that having a level of humility. And I think on top of that, the last thing I'll say is is being able to say in humility that I don't know. Like, I don't know. I cannot say in a posture of self-righteousness that my way is the best way, or that steps A, B, and C, this is how I would handle that. The reality is, it is, as we've even just touched on, they're incredibly complex issues that are multifaceted, multi-layered. And all we're trying to do, again, if we're as Christians trying to honor the Lord, love people well, that has to be the thing that's leading the conversation every single time.
Yeah, I 100% agree. When you remove the people element of it, you remove the Christ element of it, because he's about people. Exactly. And honestly, I mean, I even today had my own personal conviction of this. I was driving home from an appointment I was at X Church. I was coming back, and there's a guy begging for money on the side of the road. And, there's signs around town that say, like, don't support, don't give money. And the car in front of me gave this person money. And from the looks of it, it was obvious. It was at least 2 bills, and they weren't singles. And I think they were $20 bills. So I think it was like $40 if my eyesight was correct. And my initial reaction was annoyance that they gave him money. And then, like, immediately it was like the Holy Spirit was like, really? And it was just like that moment where I was like, you know what? I have so removed the human element of this that I've just thought about, it annoys me that someone's begging on the street. And again, it was just like, if you would have asked me maybe like earlier in the day, we were having a conversation, I would have just clearly said, yeah, this is wrong. People should not be begging on the streets. There's signs everywhere. It's a nuisance to our community, blah, blah, blah. I could have filled in like all of those things. And I looked at this guy who got the money and the joy on his face. And I just thought, man, $40, that's a game changer for this guy that obviously life has hit really, really hard, that didn't choose most likely to be homeless. And I just thought there's a human element. And it was like that deep conviction. And I thought, yes, like whenever we remove the human element and we just turn it into an issue, we remove Christ from it. And so like there is complexity on this on all sides. And that's what we have to be careful to not remove that from. So,
100%.
Well, guys, thank you so much. As always, I appreciate you willing to dive into complicated topics, even controversial. And in all seriousness, if people have issues and the questions, pushback, whatever, we always welcome. Feel free to reach out, info@Tree.Church. We'd love to engage in questions, but hopefully this will encourage people in their faith.
Yeah, for sure.